Good morning, dear learners, and welcome to the MOOC on Economics of Gender and Development. And we are in week 11, and this is module 36, and this is the last module of week 11. So, here we shall be discussing on women in the global labor market. So, the dynamics of women in the global labor market are shaped by the simultaneous forces of globalization, technological advancement, and persistent sociocultural norms. As we have already seen in the previous module, where global economic integration has the potential to lift labor market constraints for women by creating new types of employment and facilitating informational exchange, the reality is also marked by job precarity, horizontal segregation, and the motherhood penalty. So, this module examines the critical factors influencing female labor force participation (FLFP), the role of human capital, and the necessary policy interventions ranging from social protection to international trade agreements to ensure that the global economy serves as a vehicle for genuine gender empowerment. Now, looking at the labor market norms and human capital, the relationship between human capital and female labor force participation is increasingly defined by a complex interplay between education levels and the specific nature of globalized work. A primary theoretical framework for understanding this is the technology effect versus the cost effect. In the early stages of globalization, we see that many developing nations experienced a feminization of employment driven by the cost effect. Multinational corporations, MNCs, sought female labor force because it was perceived as cheaper, more obedient, and suited for the monotonous tasks of export-oriented manufacturing. However, as economies integrate further and transition toward skill-intensive production, the technology effect often prevails. Because women frequently face a gender gap in educational attainment and technical training, men often become the primary beneficiaries of high skill roles, leading to feminization, reversal, or defeminization in countries like India. This we have already seen in the previous module while discussing the IT sector. Now, human capital investment in women often follows a U-shaped path in developing contexts. This also we have already seen in the previous modules. Now, while literature or uneducated women are often forced into the labor market through economic necessity, frequently in the informal sector or as unpaid family labor, women with a moderate or secondary education may have the luxury of staying out of the force if they are not more affluent households. Only at higher levels of education does women's participation typically rise again, as their increased skills allow them to access remunerative and prestigious roles. However, recent evidence from India suggests that even with rising female literacy, female labor force participation has declined, indicating that increased human capital is not a sufficient condition for employment when suitable decent jobs are scarce or when patriarchal norms remain entrenched in the society. So, labor market norms, particularly the reproductive constraint, significantly dampen the benefits of human capital. In South Asia, social norms often dictate that younger women prioritize marriage and child rearing over their professional careers. This burden of care acts as a barrier to skill investment. Neither employers nor women themselves may see a return on investment if career paths are expected to be interrupted by domestic duties. Interestingly, informational globalization, the flow of global media and ideas, can mitigate these norms. Now, access to global information challenges traditional gender roles and promotes egalitarian views, which had been shown to positively affect the female labor force participation of women aged 35 and above, who may leverage their increased household bargaining power to enter the global market. Ultimately, to bridge the gender gap, human capital development must be paired with shifts in societal attitudes and institutional support for working mothers. Now, let us discuss the issue of localizing farms and increasing women's entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is a vital driver of innovation and economic self reliance, yet, it remains a traditionally male dominated field where women face unique structural and sociocultural barriers. In emerging economies like India and Saudi Arabia, women led startups are increasingly seen as a catalyst for social transformations. In India, for example, women led startups have shown remarkable efficiency, generating 10% more revenue over 5 years than male led firms, despite women heading only about 14% of total businesses. The motivations for women's entrepreneurship are often rooted in a desire for financial independence, which is, say, for among 40% cases, and passion, we see for 35% cases, rather than mere significant willingness to work. However, significant hurdles persist. For example, in Saudi Arabia, while Vision 2030 has dismantling legal barriers such as requirement for a male relative's consent to engage in business, women still identify lack of funding, complex government procedures, and family circumstances as primary challenges. Similarly, in India also, we see that nearly 50% of female entrepreneurs they cite funding as their budget hurdle, reflecting a global trend where only 2% of venture capital goes to women-led businesses. So, to localize firms and increase female participation, governments have introduced targeted schemes. For example, the Startup India and Stand Up India initiatives provide financial incentives and skill training especially for women in India. And digital platforms such as Niti Aayog's Women Entrepreneurship Platform serve as essential hubs for mentoring and networking. These policy measures are crucial because, as evidenced in Saudi Arabia case, women-owned companies often have higher survival rates and similar growth prospects to those owned by men when provided with an enabling environment. So, success in this arena requires moving beyond survival based self employment to growth oriented entrepreneurship supported by digital literacy and simplified access to credit. Now, when we look at the issue of social protections for women entrepreneurs and workers, we notice that social protection is a fundamental pillar for achieving gender equality in the world of work, particularly for those in the informal economy where women are primarily engaged. Now, the demand for these systems is driven by the unique risk women face, including the burden of unpaid care, and already we have discussed in the previous modules, women spend 3.2 times more hours on care work than men, and a lack of formal contacts. Now, universal social protection, USP you may call it, these frameworks call for rights-based, gender-sensitive measures that protect women throughout their life cycle, covering health, maternity, and income security. And already in the previous module, we had talked about South Africa's Child Support Grant and also Brazil's Bolsa Familia schemes. Now, studies like those indicate that such support schemes enhance women's decision-making power over resources and encourages their active involvement in their children's well-being without crowding out family support. Other than such measures, certain innovative financing models also exist for informal sector women workers. For example, India's Mathadi boards use a tripartite approach. Workers, employers, and government, these three parties, to finance financial social protection through a legislated levy on the users of labor. So this ensures that informal workers, including many women in logistics and manufacturing sector, can access provident funds and maternity benefits. Furthermore, the provision of accessible childcare is a critical social protection measure that directly correlates with higher female employment. Now, worker-led initiatives such as the Sewa Childcare Cooperatives in India and Argentina's CIRS centers provide flexible services tailored to the irregular hours of informal work, effectively reducing the motherhood penalty. So ultimately, effective governance and solidarity in financing are necessary to sustain these systems, especially in low income countries facing high debt distress. And now let us consider some of the macroeconomic policies from across the globe that facilitate women's work in the labor market. To ensure that the global labor market empowers women rather than entrenching existing disparities, macroeconomic policies must transition from gender blind neoliberalism to gender responsive frameworks. Historically, it has been noticed that macroeconomic restructuring, often delivered via International Monetary Fund (IMF) and World Bank structural adjustment programs, has frequently acted as an economic straitjacket, pushing women into the informal economy due to cuts in public expenditure and the dismantling of the existing social safety nets. Now, modern international policy now recognizes that for globalization to be inclusive, it must be accompanied by intentional interventions that addresses the reproductive constraint and the unequal distribution of care work. As indicated in the previous modules, a central global benchmark is the G20 Brisbane goal, which aimed to reduce the gender gap in labor force participation by 25% by 2025. Now, while the unweighted average gender gap across G20 nations declined from 22.2% in 2012 to 18% in 2024, many nations still lag behind their targets. Now, successful implementation has been observed in countries like Australia, which launched its first national Working for Women strategy in 2024-2034 period to prioritize economic equality and leadership. And Japan, for example, which has prioritized publicly financed vocational training to help women enter the male-dominated sectors. In contrast, countries like India and Turkey have seen gender wage gaps widen recently. Despite the improvements in participation rates, highlighting the need for policies that address job quality alongside access. A significant development in global trade governance is the inclusion of labor and gender provisions in preferential trade agreements. This issue linkage makes market access conditional on improvements in social regulation. For instance, Bahrain incorporated non-discrimination laws into its national legislation as a direct result of its preferential trade agreements with the United States. Similarly, the US CAFTA DRPTA agreement included $142 million labor capacity building program that successfully targeted women for leadership roles in unions. And in Table 1, we can see a comparative analysis of macro policy approaches and outcomes in a few countries including Australia, Saudi Arabia, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the European Union. Here we will see that in Australia, for example, Working for Women strategy has been adopted, which has helped the country surpass the Brisbane goal. And these goals have been adopted for the period 2024 to 2034. That means for a decadal time. Now, this policy also focuses on adopting gender-responsive tax relief instruments. Similarly, in Saudi Arabia, the Vision 2030 and national transformation policies have resulted in increasing the female labor force participation from 17% in 2017 to 35.6% in 2021. So, in a period of 4 years, the labor force participation of female has almost doubled in Saudi Arabia. So, through these policy measures, childcare and transport subsidies have been offered to women in the country. And India has also adopted many policy instruments recently. Among them are Mission Shakti and Skill India. But yet, quite significantly, we see stagnant or declining female labor force participation despite growth. And on the other hand, we also notice persistent defeminization in high-skill sectors like IT. And these things we already discussed in our previous module. Similarly, in the sub-Saharan Africa, policy measures like trade openness and sub-Saharan African safeguards have resulted in trade integration associated with increased gender inequality in literacy without specific safeguards. Likewise, in European Union also, policy measures like Pay Transparency Directive has been able to standardize corporate reporting, resulting in closing the unadjusted wage gap. So here in table 1, we can see 3 columns, country or region, then primary policy instruments and outcomes, key outcomes or observations. Okay, for this we see Australia, then Saudi Arabia, India, and also for Sub-Saharan Africa and European Union. Now, apart from this table, in the previous module also we also saw a comparative analysis between economic activity and political representation across countries. And there we noticed that the interaction between these two variables is often stronger in industrialized nations than in developing countries. For example, it was noticed that in Nordic countries, high female participation in parliament correlates with high rates of paid employment, whereas in many developing contexts, the boundary between paid work and household duties is less distinct, weakening this fit. Now, the digital divide remains a critical macroeconomic hurdle. While informational globalization empowers women over 35 to challenge traditional norms, rural and impoverished women often lack the access needed to benefit from the digital economy. Policies like Google's Internet Sati in India aim to bridge this literacy gap, which is essential for unlocking women's full potential. Furthermore, pay transparency measures such as European Union's Pay Transparency Directive represent necessary structural changes to address the unadjusted wage gap, which stood at 15.4% across G20 economies, as was noticed during the period 2020-23. Finally, we can say that macroeconomic stability depends on expanding fiscal space to invest in gender transformative infrastructure such as universal childcare and digital literacy. And without these measures, trade liberalization risks a race to the bottom where women's competitive advantage lies solely in lower pay and poor working conditions. Now let us examine some of the cases from developing and developed countries. The impact of globalization and liberalization on women is significantly mediated by diverse legislative, cultural, and economic context, producing varied outcomes across economic sectors. Now, while global integration provides new pathways for employment, it often reproduces existing social hierarchies or creates new forms of precarity, depending on the specific sector and the local gender order. And in the previous modules, we already discussed certain country case studies from developed and developing countries on the impacts globalization and liberalization caused on women with particular reference to the indicators like female share of labor force, percentage of female representatives in parliament. Now, in this context, we also discuss the primary strategy or consequence the respective countries adopted. Now, in this section, we shall try to look into the impact of globalization and liberalization on women with special reference to some of the economic sectors they are primarily engaged with. For example, in the agricultural sector, women in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia remain the most vulnerable. In sub-Saharan Africa, it is noticed that women are predominantly absorbed into informal smallholding farming activities. Evidence also suggests that trade openness in this region has actually increased gender inequality in literacy, as the demand for unskilled agricultural labor pulls young women out of school. In India, for example, agriculture serves as the last resort for unskilled female workers, employing 62% of female workforce, mostly as self-employed or casual labor. Policy measures at the international level, such as the WTO, World Trade Organization, reducing agricultural subsidies in wealthy nations are essential to allow African and South Asian female laborers to compete fairly in the global markets. And in manufacturing and construction, the outcomes are often contradictory. In Bangladesh, the growth of the garment sector has led to significant feminization, with female employees outnumbering men in the ratio of 4 to 1. That means 4 women against 1 man. These things we also discussed in the previous module. However, discrimination in the work environments remain high, and women are often trapped as sweat shops workers. In India, a trend of defemination has occurred in manufacturing as jobs polarize toward the highly skilled, displacing illiterate women from the job market. And in the construction sector, women face extreme horizontal segregation, representing only 10.8% of all construction managers globally. And most women in Indian construction work as casual laborers with no job social security. The education and health sectors reveal distinct challenges in developed nations. In Britain and Canada, for example, female teacher educators face intensified research cultures and fiscal constraints that have redefined their work as an exploitable resource, leading to high levels of stress and alienation. Similarly, in health and social services, women are overrepresented in nursing and midwifery, holding 75% of more of this position, yet these roles are often overworked or undervalued. And in developing contexts, women's advances in professional spheres are often supported by a shadow army of migrant domestic workers who suffer a triple disadvantage of foreigners, women, and workers in menial occupations. In Karnataka, India, for example, domestic workers' psychological well-being is often compromised by feudal employer-employee relationships and a lack of formal contracts. And in the modern services and ICT sectors, urban restructuring creates new polarizations. In globalizing cities like Tel Aviv, men have disproportionately moved into high-status management and tech roles, while women have expanded into lower-level service jobs, widening the gender earning gap. And in India, while digital platforms provide in-between spaces for mass civic action, a significant digital divide excludes rural and marginalized women from the benefits of informal globalization. Now, looking at the issue of feminization versus defeminization of work, these things we have seen in the previous module as well. But here, let us consider the job market in, say, Bangladesh export-led textile sector or high-tech IT jobs that has occurred respectively. These things we saw in the previous module as well. And let us consider figure 1. Okay. So here in figure 1, we can notice that the export-led textile sector in Bangladesh has seen feminization as women outnumber men in the 4:1 ratio. And on the contrary, we see defeminization in the Indian IT sector, where we see that female labor force participation has declined despite economic growth. Now, these two examples for Bangladesh and India show that in Bangladesh, feminization has happened in some tedious tasks, often resulting in horizontal segregation and low-wage jobs. On the other hand, in the Indian case, defeminization has occurred where production has shifted towards skill-intensive tasks, indicating that female labor force participation is declining in jobs requiring high educated technical manpower. So, in other words, what we see in the Indian IT case is the lower skilled women are being displaced as men become the primary beneficiary of high-tech job growth. So, in sector-wise analysis, we find that unskilled women often remain in subsistence farming or in the pink-collar service roles. For example, in the low-pay healthcare jobs as well, we see that 86% of women are engaged, leading to feminization of the sector. On the contrary, as we already indicated in the previous module as well, women hold only 30% of managerial positions globally, which means women are underrepresented in senior leaderships. Further, as we already indicated, in the construction sector also, near about 11% of the female are seen employed. On account of such realities, as well as considering the fact that the current age is hugely driven by the IT and digital revolution, it can be argued that universal social protection and digital literacy are essential to prevent further labor market exclusion. Thus, we can argue that to address these sectoral issues, broad gender responsive policies are required. National strategies like Australia's Working for Women strategy and Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, which provide transport and childcare subsidies, illustrate successful state-led interventions. Furthermore, the inclusion of binding labor and gender provisions in preferential trade agreements, such as US CAFTA DR, can incentivize improvements in domestic social regulations and non-discrimination laws. So, with this, we come to the end of this module, and let us briefly describe the summary, what we have so far discussed in this module. We have seen that globalization and liberalization are not gender neutral. They interact with existing patriarchal structures and socio-economic hierarchies to produce diverse outcomes for women. While global integration has created new opportunities and facilitated the flow of empowering information, it has also led to job precarity, defeminization in certain skill-intensive sectors, and the erosion of social safety nets. The technology effect often disadvantages women due to persistent educational gaps, while the cost effect leverages their labor in low-wage informal sectors. To counter these trends, gender-sensitive social protection is vital, providing women with financial independence and childcare support. Successful empowerment depends on intentional policy interventions, including the G20's Brisbane goal, the inclusion of binding gender clauses in trade agreements, and the strategic use of ICT to build transnational solidarities. Ultimately, the global economy must be transformed into a space where equality and justice are recognized as the foundational requirements for sustainable human development. So, with this, we come to the end of this module. Thank you. And in the next and the final week, there will be total 4 videos, and we shall discuss the issue of gender development and mainstreaming gender. Thank you.